Hi kiddo, I'm Grandma Goody, and I'm here to tell you a very special Bible story. This story begins on the third day after Jesus had died on the cross. And there was a small group of women who loved Jesus who were up very, very early this Sunday morning. It was so early that it was still dark outside and the birds were just beginning to sing. And these women, they were so sad. They had had a very, very sad weekend because on that Friday, they had seen Jesus nailed to a cross, and they had watched for 3 hours while he suffered, and they had watched him die. And they had seen when Joseph and Nicodemus had taken down his broken dead body and carried it to a little tomb that was like a little closet carved out of the side of the rock hillside where he had been crucified. And these women had followed along and watched to see these men wrap Jesus's body in a cloth. And they had to hurry because they had to get this done before the sun went down and no one could work. And they packed his body with perfumes and they hurried and they carried him into that little closet-like room cut out of the rock. And there was a bed made out of stone. And they had laid Jesus's dead body right there on that stone bench. And these women had gone away sobbing and weeping, and they had spent all of Friday night and all of Saturday mourning Jesus's death. But once Saturday was over and they could do some work again without breaking the law, they decided that they were going to get up early and they were going to find some way to get past that big old stone that had been rolled in front of the tomb's doorway. And they was going to give Jesus a proper burial, the kind of respect that he deserved. So they had been busy preparing lots of spices and perfumes and ointments. And they snuck out in the dark of the morning, and they didn't even know when they got to that tomb how they were going to get past the soldiers that were guarding it and how they were going to get that stone rolled away. But these women were determined to honor Jesus whom they loved. And so they walked through that cold morning air, and when they got there, something had happened. The soldiers who had been guarding the tomb were all gone. And that big old stone had been rolled away and it was off to the side. And the door to that tomb was open. And as they hurried into that little darkened room where Jesus's body had been laid, the sun was just peeking up over the horizon and the light was starting to shine. And they could see enough to see that the wrappings, the mummy-like shape of the cloth that Jesus had been wrapped in was still laying there. But it was empty. Jesus's body had disappeared. It was just an empty shell of cloth hardened with perfume. And before they knew what to make of that, suddenly the whole little stone room was illuminated. The bright light shined from these two men. Well, they weren't really men. They were two beings who looked like men had appeared right there with them. And they were shining in dazzling clothes. And they said to the women, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Jesus is not here. He has risen from the dead. Don't you remember when you were up in Galilee how Jesus had told you that he was going to be arrested by the chief priests and he was going to be crucified and he would die and be buried. And on the third day, he would rise from the dead." They remembered that. And they believed. Well, he died on Friday. That was the first day. and that he was dead on Saturday. That was the second day. And this is Sunday morning, and it's the third day. And just like Jesus promised, he is not here. He is risen. And they dashed off and they ran all the way back to where the disciples, the 11 disciples, were hiding because they were afraid that the people who had arrested and killed Jesus might come and arrest and kill them too. Now, it was a very different scene inside that room because there were only 11 disciples. And on Friday, they had either seen or heard that Jesus had died on the cross. And there were only 11 because one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, had done just like Jesus said he was going to do. And he had betrayed him to the religious leaders, and he got paid to show them where they could find him to arrest him. And after Judas had seen that Jesus was convicted and sentenced to death, their friend Judas had gone out and hung himself, and he was dead too. So this was a sad and sorry group of men in hiding, broken-hearted, when these women came rushing to the door, and they knew where they were hiding, so they were able to find them. And they said, "Let us in, let us in. We have good news." And so they let the women in. And the women came in, and they told them what had happened. They told them about going to the tomb and going inside and seeing the empty grave clothes. And while they were trying to figure it out, that the angels had appeared to them, and they had said, "Why are you looking for someone who's alive where only a dead person should be?" And they said, "Don't you remember? He told us when we were in Galilee. Remember? He told us this was going to happen. And now Jesus is risen from the dead." And the women were so excited, and they were just going on and all talking at the same time. But the disciples, they listened to what the women said, but they thought it was just nonsense, and they didn't believe it. But Peter was there too. Now, the night that Jesus was arrested, Peter had denied that he even knew Jesus 3 times. And that broke Peter's heart when Jesus looked at him. And Peter got up, and he opened the door, and he risked going out into that morning where the sun was beginning to rise. And Peter ran to that little tomb, and he stooped down, and he looked inside the door, and he saw the grave clothes, and he saw that they was empty, and he didn't know what to think. He didn't go back with the others. Instead, Peter went home alone. That is the end of part 1 of Jesus' disappearing act. Go on over and watch the rest of the story in part 2. It gets even more exciting. You're going to find it in the New Testament, in the book of Luke, chapter 24. And the verses, those are the itty-bitty numbers in between the words. You're going to start in verse 1 and go all the way to verse 34. And if you're using the secret code, it's LUK 24 and the 2 dots, then 1 to 34. Now, kiddo, you remember, Grandma Goody loves you, but God loves you more. And on this special day, I like to say, Jesus Christ is risen. He is risen indeed.